All right, so in this presentation, I'm going to talk about public sector labor unions and state and local budgets. This section of the course is about economic and budgetary policy, and a previous section was about specifically labor unions and right to work. And so this week, we look at budget deficits with some special attention given to public employee labor unions. And we have a couple of policy briefs that are assigned for this week that deal with public sector unions and their role in budget issues at the state level. So one makes the argument that public sector unions are bad for state budget deficits and state debt, and the other makes the argument that that is not true. So we have opposing policy briefs in this week's section. So Edwards 2010 in Public Sector Unions argues that the public sector labor unions are important to examine because they have a major influence on government policies through their vigorous lobbying efforts. So public employee unions are often pointed to as very strong in their lobbying efforts, especially at the state level with, say, the National Education Association. And they fund their operations through union dues and fees and by maintaining their membership. And like any other interest group, they lobby for policies that benefit them. So Edwards argues that collective bargaining is a misguided labor policy because it violates civil liberties like freedom of association and gives unions excessive power to block reforms. Oftentimes, teachers' unions blocking certain education reforms are pointed to as where unions have become too powerful. The takeaway point from the Edwards policy brief is that to provide policymakers with greater flexibility and to improve government efficiency, states should ban collective bargaining in the public sector. So basically the argument here is take away collective bargaining rights from public employees. You give public managers more flexibility to determine wages and benefits and working conditions, and these things will then save local governments and state governments money. Because, of course, the collective bargaining power of labor unions drives up wages. Which then, of course, drives up spending. Now, one common argument when it comes to controlling budgets and labor unions is that the burden of the higher costs of government is on someone else. It's on the taxpayers and not the employer. So this is where public sector unions are different from private sector unions. Unionization in the private sector is maybe less politically controversial for a couple of reasons. One of them being that there's not much unionization in the private sector these days, so it's not that controversial because they hardly exist. The other reason that private sector unionization is less controversial than public sector unions is that when a labor union, say a unionized workforce at Kroger, when they collectively bargain a pay increase and their health benefits, when they collectively bargain and get more money in the process and get some kind of pay raise, they are cutting into the corporation's profits. That's the slice of the pie they're getting into. When it comes to public employees, say your teachers, police, firefighters, the argument here is that they're negotiating with public administrators or school boards, and they're not cutting into profits because those things are public services, so they don't make widgets. They don't have profit margins, they're cutting into tax dollars. And so the burden of the higher cost of the pay increase for the public employees is on the taxpayers. So the argument often comes down to that public employee unions shouldn't be able to negotiate these higher wages because what they're actually negotiating is higher taxes for your taxpayers. So, in the Edwards piece, he points out that the author points out that public sector workers with collective bargaining rights have higher wages and better benefits than non-unionized public sector workers, which makes sense. They collectively bargain, so they have more. They have a seat at the table, and they're able to win concessions, get higher raises than in places where they don't collectively bargain. And one of the other things they point out, that Edwards points out, is that there's a high cost to local economies when public sector workers go on strike. So think about the burden on local economies when people have to stay home with their kids because the teachers in Chicago are on strike, and so that's something that that is pointed out here in the Edwards piece. Now, there are some counter arguments to be made for all of these points, but this is the point being made here, and that the solution then is to take away collective bargaining rights from public employees. So then we have the other piece, the Allegretto piece, the wrong target. And in the wrong target, Allegretto and co-authors point out that the economy fell off a cliff during the Great Recession. States introduced bills related to public employee collective bargaining rights right at the end and just following the Great Recession, so around when this piece was written, 2010, 2011. And this piece argues that public employees are the wrong target for fixing state budget problems because of things like public sector employment not growing over time. So public sector employment remains steady as a share of all employment before and after the Great Recession. But budget deficits got much worse during the Great Recession. Public sector compensation as a share of public budgets hadn't grown over time. And they point out that public employees are not compensated at a higher, more highly than their private sector counterparts when you take into account education and experience. So one of the arguments against public employee unions is that they inflate wages and benefits, but if you look at private sector counterparts and account for education and experience, they're really not being compensated more highly than their private sector counterparts. And so basically they're arguing that the budget shortfall following the Great Recession wasn't because of the power of public employee unions. Politicians were using the budget crisis as an opportunity to go after a political adversary. So the budget woes were due more to like the housing bubble and other aspects of the Great Recession and not public sector unions. So they argue that the scrutiny against the numbers don't add up, and that the claim that public sector unions are a major cause of state budget deficits doesn't really hold up to scrutiny. That you can, and in both of these pieces, so that's both of these policy briefs in a nutshell. There are good points and possible criticisms of each, but it's interesting when you look at these two pieces that one is arguing about government efficiency, and it's a very logical argument that, look, unions drive up wages, they take away managing power from administrators. Therefore, we can control our budgets better if we don't have to negotiate with unions. And on the other hand, the other piece presents this argument that, well, those numbers don't really there isn't this evidence that that the Great Recession and budget problems was actually caused by the power of public employee unions. So consider both arguments. Consider the different evidence that they're pointing to, and thank you.